Anytime I'm speaking about mechanical ventilation, I feel compelled to wear this shirt. So I'm going to unveil my shirt. It's the Punisher, and I believe that today's mechanical ventilation approaches are indeed punishing our patients. And so I'm hoping that in the short time moving forward, that we will have better ways to ventilate. And certainly APRV is one of those potential methodologies. My disclosure, I am the Chief Science Officer at Lung Treater, and I'm a Chief Executive Officer at VentDX. VentDX is a company out of Oxford, but it's not commercially available. It's for research only. You might ask, why is this respiratory therapist talking about advancing the future of mechanical ventilation? These are some of my technologies that I've brought to market, and I would say that I'm quite lucky to have worked with excellent physicians and terrific engineers. So the topic is monitoring, and at my age, I remember pulling out the Webster's Dictionary or the Oxford Language Dictionary and looking things up. Oxford defines monitoring as the ability to observe and check the progress or quality of something over time, keeping it under an important method, systematic review. Merriam-Webster defines it as watching and keeping track of or checking for a special purpose. Indeed, mechanical ventilation is a special purpose. Care is a special purpose. And then my simple definition is just pay attention. Pay attention to what you're doing in terms of monitoring. So keeping things simple. I'm also a regulatory person, help discuss things with the FDA, and I'm usually using regulatory language. So when we think of mechanical ventilation, I would put it into a rule of three, that we are obviously looking to oxygenate. We're obviously looking to manage CO2. And in many cases, we're looking at managing the work of breathing. So what is it that, and I'm surprised, particularly in the advent of high flow, that we have to revisit this with our clinical people, but we have oxygen concentration and we have mean airway pressure, and those are prime drivers of oxygenation. We look to minute ventilation and tidal volume and frequency to be a primary driver for CO2 removal or ventilation, and those processes happen independent of each other. Anyone who's done apneic diffusion studies for brain death understands that. And then work of breathing. And in the 80s and 90s, we were very, very concerned about the work to trigger, the work to sustain the breath, and the work to exhale. I still think the work to exhale is very, very important. When I design a ventilator, that's where I start, at the exhalation valve. That's very, very important. And then, as a matter of trivia, I wonder if anyone knows what was the first ventilator to be able to measure power. Okay, funny enough, it was the 7200 from Puritan Bennett. And what you would do is you would take the ordinate on the loops and slide the entire breath to the right, so that the entire breath was sitting on the left side, and it would calculate a joules per liter for you. And we didn't know what it was for. We didn't have much thought, but I found it very curious, in particular because I grew up on the 900C, where we used to punish our patients by cranking up the working pressure. ARDS, okay, poor compliance, poor impedance, crank up that working pressure. And so that was a very, very informative and interesting attribute of the 7200 that nobody knew. I actually had to argue with the engineers on the 840 to put in power. They kept saying to me, why would you want that? And I, as the boss said, put it in. And we know where that ended up. So what is mechanical ventilation? What are we doing? Regulatory wise, we are applying a machine to a human, and we call it a PEMS, a programmable electromechanical system. And we do that in order to achieve one of those three objectives I've talked about. So how does a PEMS work? And how does a ventilator work? And how do these modes work? Well, boiling it down to a simplistic thought process, the device simply meters either force from the wall, 50 psi oxygen or air, or it generates its own force in the case of a blower to generate air, or a piston to generate air again. And that is mixed with high pressure oxygen. So the mechanical ventilator is essentially in every mode of ventilation targeting a pressure or targeting a flow over time. We as marketers tend to chase tenders, tend to chase business. And so what happens is we make up these silly names for modes that may mean the same thing. They may be slightly different, but at the end of the day, we're either having the engineers target pressure or flow over time. So now, looking at those functions, let's talk about some of the basic in-the-box monitoring that occurs. Obviously, for oxygenation, we're monitoring oxygen concentration. Now, a lot of people like to put FiO2 on their ventilators, but we use those ventilators non-invasively. We use those ventilators in situations where we're not meeting inspiratory demand. So I just pound myself when I see FiO2 on high flow devices. It's not FiO2, it's O2 concentration. That's my pet peeve for the talk. We should be looking at end expiratory pressure and mean airway pressure. For CO2, we're looking again, as I said before, at the tidal volumes and the minute ventilation delivered, but also perhaps expired CO2. And more recently, we've turned our attention, particularly after the Cressoni article, towards pressures and force. We classically look at in-the-box dynamic and static mechanics, and we look at, thanks to Amato, we look more at driving pressures as well. Desynchrony, I'm going to talk a little bit, or I'll share with you in a minute a little bit more about desynchrony, but certainly waveforms have opened our eyes to what is happening with the patient interface. And respiratory drive. I'm an advocate for respiratory rate. To me, respiratory rate tells us a lot. And we heard about the high flow monitoring earlier this morning from Dr. Zhang. Respiratory rate is just an essential piece of the puzzle, and I would suggest we should all be monitoring respiratory rate with a great level of intensity. P100, of course, many people don't know that P200 was really the indice, but unfortunately, Millick Emily went out lecturing about P100, so he went back to Mike Goldberg and Magda Jonas and said, it shall be P100. And they did find that P200 was a little bit more accurate, more reliable. So now let's step outside the box and outside the PEMS and focus more on patient-centric approaches. So in this particular case, obviously, these are things we all know. We're looking at blood gases, PaO2, SaO2 with the co-oximeter. We're using a very insensitive device called the pulse oximeter to monitor saturation. Go ahead, guys, and attach that to your ventilator and try to be intelligent. But pulse oximetry's got a lot of work to be done before it becomes a sensitive indicator. Okay, it's good for safety. I'll give them that. Cardiac output. We should be monitoring mixed venous when available, particularly on our sickest patients. Again, for CO2, PaCO2, There are a number of volumetric capnography techniques available. In research, we're now seeing the presence and measurement of IL-6, IL-8s, and CXCL1s. Again, this is for research to look at the early onset and the continued onset of inflammation. Mechanical power is an important one, although many times we have these technologies available to us, and it takes some time for us to appreciate them. Desynchrony, it's all about the patient. We should be watching the patient. Signs of agonal breathing and discomfort are very, very important. And in respiratory drive, physical assessment is again very important, coupled with monitoring of respiratory rate. And esophageal balloon pressure is now becoming popular. There's an organization now called the Plug. It's Marcel Amado. Oh no, it's actually Laurent Brochard's and Tommaso Mori's group out of Harvard and Barcelona. They bounce back and forth. They're studying, a whole entire group studying esophageal balloon and transthoracic pressure. So that's an interesting occurrence. I released the Vicor monitor back in 88, 89, and now we're starting to see esophageal balloon monitoring. So it takes a while sometime. I'd like to, again, indicate that state of the art means standard of practice. It doesn't mean cutting edge. That's very important when you're talking to the FDA about state of the art. And keeping things under systematic review is very important, with the idea that the quality of ventilation is important. So if we look at the quality of ventilation monitoring over the past decades, we'll see that in the 80s, the late 80s, Gattinoni introduced the concept of the baby lung. Obviously, the lung was smaller than expected. We're losing effective lung volume. And today is a very important concept we're all thinking about, but I would suggest that Dr. Downs and Burkhard Lachmann and others had indicated the importance of opening the lung and keeping it open. In the 90s, we then took that and started to focus on optimal PEEP. Anybody here know what optimal PEEP is? If you do, I want to learn from you, but optimal PEEP, we embraced low tidal volume and again, started to use esophageal balloons. And then in moving all the way to 2000, ARDSNet drove us into what some would consider a crazy process of cookbook, 6 to 8 ml per kg approach. In fact, I had left mechanical ventilation for a while, was working in pediatric asthma, wanted to take care of a big problem in the asthmatic population, came back during COVID in 2020 to find that I had to enter a height or a ideal body weight in order to get to the ventilator. And I'm like, what is this? And actually about 8 months ago, Marcel Amado stood up at the Plug meeting and said he was sorry for imposing that thought concept on the world. NIV, high flow nasal cannula, and EIT, very, very popular during the 2020s. High flow nasal cannula introduced and accepted in 2017, the New England Journal of Medicine article, and the use with hypoxemic respiratory failure was very, very important. We found out during COVID that it did clear CO2, and then eventually we realized it was a humidifier, and you know what? Humidifiers are important too. So those as an indication for use became very, very popular, and high flow has found its way on mechanical ventilators as well as standalone devices. And then today, we've seen, again, the proliferation of EIT. There's a couple of commercial devices out there, but it seems to be stuck in research only because of the labor intensity of putting the patches on patients and monitoring them. But it is a very, very important technology. It's been very helpful in assessing the benefits of proning, and EIT is certainly a item for the future. IST is the inspired sine wave technique, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then the word of the day, AI, right? Artificial intelligence. Yet I would submit that, and I hope there are no materials management people here, but I would submit that where we need to apply AI in hospital care and medicine is with the material managers. I think there's some room there to save. So that's my thoughts on the quality of mechanical ventilation. And as you see, mortality really made some steps forward. And of course, this is a global look at mortality, but I think we still have a big step to take in ARDS mortality. And I'm hoping that we can take a step forward. Now, this is a study done by Guillermo Gutierrez out of Houston, where his group of engineers created something called a forest algorithm set. And that algorithm set was designed to look at detecting asynchrony on the mechanical ventilator. What they did is they had an expert group of clinicians do something called a multi-reader test, where the clinicians score and identify these epochs, and then they compare it in an agreement analysis to what the algorithms are doing. And they found very, very decent accuracy in both detecting asynchrony, in classifying asynchrony, in looking at the extent of the disruption, and also identifying hyperinflation. And you'll see these are reasonable kappas and inter-reader scores, such that the conclusion was that machine learning algorithms can effectively emulate expert clinicians in the assessment of breathing patterns in mechanically ventilated patients. We've also seen the similar type of thing occur in the measurement of adventitious breath sounds. This technique has also shown that the systems can detect wheezing and the extent of wheezing, whether it's polyphonic or singular, and differentiate that from tracheal stridor, and be able to agree with what clinicians would do in the monitoring. So I still would submit to you that everything we're doing in terms of caring for our ventilated patients seems to be retrospective. We see the curve over-distended, we react. We see the gases aren't sufficient, we react. And so these signals of harm tend to be retrospective, and I'm hoping in the future we can take steps towards prospective assessment. I think we need both, obviously, but what I would like to do is see us flip the script, where we have tools that can prospectively tell us the status of the patient and what should be done, and whether or not our move on the ventilator, mode, pressure, oxygen, whatever, is beneficial to the patient. And one such promise is the inspired sine wave technique. It's similar to the SF6 technique, or the multi-inert gas technique that West Physiology described back in the 80s with the use of sulfur hexafluoridine, where trace gas was used to determine FRC. However, Andrew Farmery and Fian Fan, both professors at Oxford, developed a more biocompatible methodology of providing a highly soluble trace gas, nitrous oxide. We have nitrous oxide in our whipped cream containers, and they're pulsing in at various sine levels, nitrous oxide, and this allows them to measure the effective lung volume, that which is participating in gas exchange, the effective pulmonary perfusion, which essentially is cardiac output, the total dead space, which includes your anatomical dead space, your physiologic dead space, and can also make Francois Lelouch very happy in Toronto, in that we can measure instrumental dead space, all of that in one, and look at what is happening with these 600 million tonometers that we call our alveoli, and how synchronous they're inflating and how dysynchronous they're inflating, and what their interface to perfusion is. So there are over 15 articles. I didn't quote them all here. The Nature article was presented in 2022, which looked at COPD patients and allowed the classification in accordance with the gold standard. And of course, in management of mechanical ventilation, it's very, very useful when we can use such a model to know the size of the baby lung constantly, and know that we don't need to inflate beyond that. Measurement coupled with power, where we make changes in pressure or changes in volume, we can see whether that's affecting perfusion or whether that's providing strain or stress. We might have a look at the optimization of PEEP, and where lung healing or deterioration of the lung is occurring, we can monitor that through inhomogeneity or homogeneity indexes. So I would suggest that the future is bright, but it will require us to optimize ventilation to improve safety and effectiveness by improving outcomes and reducing cost by using the parameters we currently use, but coupling it with advanced powers of power and the ability to see real-time monitoring of what's happening in the lung. And I would also suggest that AI, as we talk about it today, is really not AI, it's algorithms. But when we couple AI with HI, which is human intelligence, we can be unstoppable, and we need both. So that's my talk. I hope I caught us up on some time. And these are my references. I'm happy to share these articles with anyone if you just send me an email. And thank you very much again for allowing me to speak at the society. It's a wonderful society, and it is going to be instrumental in moving mechanical ventilation forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was good. Questions?
I'm going to button this up.
Yeah.
All right. Yes, sir.
Also, critical care monitors now in at patient's bedside. Nursing monitors include calculations for right to left intrapulmonary shunt, and also for dead space ventilation. And I don't see them being used very often. Do you have any thoughts about how that might work out in the future?
So I mentioned earlier that I believe the mechanical ventilator starts at the valve, starts at the exhalation valve initially, and grows from there. I see the potential where we may have one homogeneous monitor that has the essential technology. But what we're doing right now is we are presenting indices that are dependent on humans to look at them and do things. And you hit the nail on the head. What we probably need to develop is something to coach our team at the bedside. Not that they don't know what they're doing, but they've got a million things coming at them. And if something can alert them, alerting will be the first step, I believe, and then guidance the second step. And protocolization really allows us to measure our standard of care and to see where areas of improvement are necessary. So my hope is that this technology can make it somewhere in the ICU, whether it's on the ventilator or whether it's in the patient nursing monitor. It needs to get into it needs to get there at the